Hello everyone, welcome to Anatomia. So today we will be discussing the osteology of the facial bones and the skull. So basically, skull consists of brain case and the facial bones. What is brain case? So brain case consists of a rounded calvaria and a complex base. Now skull is formed by 8 bones. Some of them are paired and some of them are unpaired. So paired are the parietal and the temporal, whereas unpaired are frontal, occipital, sphenoid and the ethmoid. Now about the facial bones, they are 14 in number. They also are categorized into the paired and the unpaired bones. So unpaired are vomer and mandible, whereas paired are maxillary, palatine, zygomatic, nasal, lacrimal and inferior concha. So we'll start with the facial bones. So firstly, before discussing the facial bones, we will first see the orbit. So the orbit. So orbit is cone shaped, narrow, and posteriorly region basically widens towards large anterior opening. And its anterior opening are thickened and constricted also. And the medial walls of both orbit are parallel to each other. Now we'll look at the borders of the orbit. So the roof is basically formed by the frontal bone, whereas the lateral wall is formed by the zygomatic. After this, the medial floor is formed by maxilla and the palatine. They both form the medial floor. The maxilla and palatine form the medial floor. After this, the medial wall is formed by ethmoid and lacrimal. The medial wall. And the last, sphenoid, forms the posterior. Moving forward, at posteriorly apex, there is opening of optic canal and optic nerve passes through optic canal, and lateral to this there is elongated and irregular shaped orbital fissure is there, and from here the artery for eyeball sensory nerves passes. Now we'll talk about the zygomatic bone. So zygomatic bone, it is diamond shaped and below and lateral to the orbit. You can see in this diagram that it's below and laterally present to the orbit. After this, it is the widest part of cheek. Second point, at outer edge, it adjoins frontal bone and sphenoid and maxilla within the orbit. One more thing to cover, it forms central part of zygomatic arch by its attachment to maxilla in front and to zygomatic process of temporal bone at the sides. Now it has processes. Basically 3 processes are there in zygomatic bone. One is the frontal process, next is the temporal, and third is the maxillary. We can show you in diagram. It's the frontal process, and here is the temporal process. So talking about each, the frontal process forms anterior lateral orbital wall. The temporal, this process forms the zygomatic arch along with zygomatic process of temporal bone, and the maxillary process forms a part of infra-orbital rim and a small part of anterior part of orbital wall. Moving forward, we have the nasal bone. So nasal bone, it is a small flat bone of skull. It is located medial to frontal process of maxilla. It is roughly rectangle in shape. Roughly rectangle shaped. It has two surfaces and four borders. Now, as you can see in the diagram, it is a paired bone. It has the left and the right portion, and it is connected. The left and the right is portion is connected by this. This is called the internasal suture. Now, as I said, it has two surfaces. The two surfaces are the external surface and the internal surface. The external surface, it is transversely convex, whereas the internal surface, it is concave and it has a long groove for anterior ethmoidal nerve. Now talking about the borders, it has four borders: superior, lateral, inferior, and the medial. We can show this in diagram. It's the superior border. This is the medial border. This portion, it is the lateral border, and this is the inferior border. Now, the superior border, it connects with nasal part of the frontal bone, and it will form the frontonasal suture. Lateral, it will connect to frontal process of maxilla and will form nasomaxillary suture. Inferiorly, with lateral cartilage of nose, whereas medially with each other, only they connect.
So now continue with the maxillary bone. The maxillary forms the upper jaw, much of the hard palate, and medial floor of the orbit and lateral base of the nose. The upper teeth are present in the alveolar process of the maxilla, and the tooth is incurred with a deep socket that is called as alveolus. Just below the orbit, there is on the anteriorly maxillary bone, there is presence of the infraorbital foramen. As you can see in the diagram, there is the alveolar process in which the upper teeth are present, the alveolar yolks that in which the tooths are incurred, and the infraorbital foramen that is present on the anterior view of the maxillary bone. And it consists of a body and four projections. The four projections are frontal, zygomatic, palatine, and alveolar. Now continue with the body. It is the largest, pyramidal shape, and it consists of the maxillary sinus. And there is a presence of infraorbital foramen. The body contributes to the anterior margin and floor of the bony orbit, and the inferior part of the body consists of the infratemporal fossa. Now continuing with the four processes, the first is the frontal process. It has a vertical ridge that is present on the medial border of the orbit called as anterior lacrimal crest. On the superomedially, it gives close contact with the anterior ethmoidal sinus, and posteriorly it forms a lacrimal groove with the lacrimal bone. The second process is the zygomatic process, as it grows laterally and meets the zygomatic bone as per the name zygomatic process. The third process is the alveolar process. It forms a maxillary dental arc containing 8 cavities holding the upper teeth. And the last process is the palatine process. It is the horizontal extension on medial side of the bone consisting of the roof of the mouth and floor of the nasal cavity. It also forms the hard palate, and there is incisive foramen that can be found on the medial line just posterior to the incisor teeth. As you can see in the diagram, there are the four processes: the palatine process, alveolar process, frontal process, and the zygomatic process. So now the next bone is the palatine bone. The palatine bone is a paired bone present between the maxilla and pterygoid process of the sphenoid bone. It participates in building 3 cavities within the skull, that are oral cavity, nasal cavity, and the orbital cavity. It is composed of 2 plates, the horizontal and perpendicular, that are connected and gives the L shape to the bone. So now we will first discuss the horizontal plate. It is quadrangular in structure, and it comprises the bony core of the posterior quarter of hard palate and a part of nasal cavity. It has 4 borders. The first, that is the medial border, which articulates with the horizontal plate of contralateral palatine bone. The second border is the lateral border that continues with the perpendicular plate, and it features the greater palatine foramen that passes the greater palatine nerve and the vessels. The third border is the anterior border that articulates with the palatine process of the maxilla, and lastly, the posterior border that faces posterior wall of the pharynx. The next plate is the perpendicular plate. It continues from the lateral margin of the horizontal plate, and it has 2 surfaces, the nasal and the maxillary. As per the name, the nasal surface faces the nasal cavity. Its inferior part is marked by a concavity that contributes to the inferior nasal meatus. Superior to this, there is a conchal crest present that articulates with the inferior nasal concha, and the next surface is the maxillary surface. It articulates with the nasal surface of the maxilla. It is mostly rough except is the posterior, superior, and anterior portions that are smooth. It is also marked by a groove that is called as the greater palatine groove that transmit the structures that are passing through the greater palatine foramen. It also has 4 borders: the anterior that articulates with the inferior nasal concha, the posterior that articulates with the medial pterygoid plate of sphenoid bone, and the third border, superior, that articulates with the sphenoid bone, and last, the inferior border that continues with the lateral border of the horizontal plate. Lastly, it has 3 processes: the pyramidal, orbital, and the sphenoid. The pyramidal arises from the junction between both the plates, horizontal and perpendicular. It forms a part of lateral wall of nasal cavity and contains greater and lesser palatine foramen. The second process is the orbital process. It is thin, triangular process that projects upward and forward from the junction of both plates. It forms part of the floor of the orbit. And the last process is the sphenoid. It is a small, pointed process that projects upwards and backwards from the perpendicular plate. It articulates with the sphenoid bone to form part of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. Now we will focus on the diagram of the palatine bone. Here you can see there is a perpendicular plate, the horizontal plate that is giving its L-shaped structure to the bone. And there are processes: the maxillary process, orbital process, and the pyramidal process. So let's move forward to the lacrimal bone. It is the smallest bone of the skull and most fragile. It has 2 surfaces and 4 borders. The 2 surfaces are lateral and medial. The lateral surface faces towards the contents of the orbit, referred to as orbital surface, and the medial surface faces nasal cavity. That's why it is called as nasal surface. The lateral surface, the first notable feature is the posterior lacrimal crest, that is a vertical ridge, and anterior to this ridge there is a lacrimal groove that is longitudinally present on the lateral surface. The medial surface, a long furrow is present that corresponds to the posterior lacrimal crest, and anterior to this furrow is a portion that forms a part of the middle nasal meatus. Moving forward to its border, there are 4 borders. The first is the anterior border that articulates with the frontal process of the maxilla. The posterior border articulates with the orbital lamina of ethmoid bone, and the superior border articulates with the frontal bone, and last, the inferior border divides divided into two parts by the inferior edge of the posterior lacrimal crest, and the two parts are anteriorly part and the posteriorly part. The posteriorly part articulates with the orbital plate of the maxilla, and the anteriorly it extends downwards, and this extension is called as the descending process and articulates with the lacrimal process of the inferior nasal concha. Thank you for watching our video and wait for the next part.